On the morning of September 8, 1944, Londoners heard nothing unusual. There was no air raid siren, no rising engine sound, no warning at all. Then a house on Chiswick High Road simply vanished. The explosion came without sound. The blast shattered buildings, collapsed walls, and killed civilians instantly. Witnesses would later say the bomb seemed to appear out of nowhere, as if the city itself had exploded. Moments later, they heard a thunderous crack in the sky. It was the sound of something arriving after it had already struck. British authorities were baffled. Radar stations had detected nothing. Fighter patrols had seen nothing. Anti-aircraft batteries had fired nothing. Yet a weapon had struck London with devastating accuracy. Within hours, intelligence officers realized the truth. Germany had done it. They had built a weapon that could not be intercepted, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. This was the V-2 rocket, the world's first ballistic missile, and by the time it appeared, it terrified everyone, precisely because it arrived too late to save the regime that built it. But to understand why the V-2 caused such fear, you have to go back years earlier, long before London was ever struck. The idea began in the early 1930s, not as a weapon of terror, but as a dream of spaceflight. A young German engineer named Wernher von Braun was obsessed with rockets. He believed liquid-fueled rockets could reach heights no aircraft ever could. At first, the German military showed little interest. Expensive, inaccurate, traditional artillery and aircraft seemed far more practical. But everything changed in 1939 when war erupted. Germany's leadership became obsessed with weapons that could bypass traditional defenses. As Allied bombing intensified, the need for a weapon that could strike back without risking pilots became urgent. By 1942, the project had evolved into something radical. On October 3, 1942, at the Peenemünde Research Facility on the Baltic coast, a rocket known as A4 was launched. It reached an altitude of over 80 kilometers, crossed the edge of space, and landed more than 190 kilometers away. It worked. For the first time in history, a human-made object had traveled faster than sound and delivered a payload over long distance. Nazi leadership was stunned. Hitler reportedly exclaimed that it was a miracle weapon. The rocket would later be renamed the V2 Vergeltungswaffe 2, meaning weapon of vengeance. But here's the crucial point most documentaries gloss over. The V2 was ready in 1942. It was not used until late 1944. That delay would doom its impact, because while engineers refined the weapon, the war changed faster than technology could keep up. The V2 was terrifying, but it was also incredibly complex. Each rocket required thousands of precision-manufactured parts. It needed rare fuels, delicate gyroscopes, and highly trained crews. Worse, Allied bombing campaigns devastated German industry. In August 1943, the British Royal Air Force launched Operation Hydra. Bombing Peenemünde, hundreds were killed, including key engineers. Production was forced underground, literally into tunnels like the Mittelwerk, built using concentration camp slave labor. This slowed everything. By the time mass production began, Germany was already losing. When the first V-2s finally launched in September 1944, the effect was immediate and horrifying. Unlike the earlier V-1 flying bombs, which buzzed loudly and could be shot down, the V-2 arrived silently. It traveled at over Mach 4. No fighter could intercept it. No gun could track it. No radar could warn civilians in time. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill later admitted that the V-2 created a unique terror, not panic, but helplessness. People could do nothing. By the end of the war, over 3,000 V-2 rockets were launched. They killed an estimated 9,000 civilians and injured tens of thousands more. But here is the brutal irony. More people died building the V-2 than were killed by it. Over 20,000 forced laborers died in the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp producing the rockets. The weapon was not just terrifying, it was pointless. Each V-2 cost more than a bomber aircraft. It delivered a small warhead with poor accuracy. It consumed resources Germany could no longer afford. Allied commanders feared it, but they also recognized something chilling. This was the future, a weapon that arrived faster than warning, a weapon that made defense irrelevant, a weapon that could not be stopped once launched. Had it appeared earlier in 1942 or 1943, the war in Europe might have looked very different. But by 1944, it was too late. Germany had built a weapon years ahead of its time and deployed it years too late. And that is why the V-2 terrified everyone, not because it won battles, but because it proved that the age of unstoppable weapons had begun. By the time British intelligence confirmed what had struck London, the damage was already done, not just to buildings but to confidence. The V-2 rocket had crossed a line no weapon had crossed before. On September 8, 1944, the first successful V-2 strike on London killed civilians instantly. Within days, more rockets followed, not in waves like bomber formations, not with the familiar warning of sirens, just sudden destruction, random, unpredictable, and unstoppable. At first, British authorities hesitated to acknowledge what was happening. Publicly admitting that a new German weapon could not be intercepted risked panic. Instead, early explosions were attributed to gas mains, structural failures, or delayed action bombs. Newspapers were instructed to downplay speculation. But Londoners knew something was different. There was no aircraft noise, no falling whistle, no time to react. People described hearing the explosion first, then seconds later, a violent crack in the air. It felt unnatural. Survivors said it was as if the laws of cause and effect had been reversed. Within weeks, V-2 strikes expanded beyond London. Antwerp, a critical Allied supply port captured in September 1944, became the primary target. Between October 1944 and March 1945, more than 1,600 V-2 rockets were fired at Antwerp. The results were devastating. One strike on December 16, 1944, hit the Rex Cinema, killing 567 people, mostly civilians and Allied soldiers on leave. It remains one of the deadliest single V-2 attacks of the war. For Allied commanders, Antwerp was vital. It was the logistical lifeline feeding the advance into Germany. And now it was being attacked by a weapon that could not be stopped. That reality forced an uncomfortable admission. There was no defense. Fighter aircraft were useless. V-2s traveled at over Mach 4, reaching the target in minutes. Radar detection occurred too late for interception. Anti-aircraft guns could not elevate or track fast enough. Even when launches were detected, the window for response was measured in seconds. The weapon had eliminated reaction time. This was not merely a tactical problem, it was a psychological one. Military planners were used to adapting. New threats could be countered with new tactics. Even the V-1 flying bomb, terrifying as it was, had been neutralized through fighter interception, flak corridors, and electronic countermeasures. The V-2 offered none of that. Once launched, it was inevitable. Allied intelligence scrambled for answers. Reconnaissance flights intensified. Spy networks were activated. Analysts pored over fragmented reports, trying to determine launch locations, production capacity, and future targets. The goal was not interception, it was prevention. If the rockets could not be stopped in flight, they had to be stopped on the ground. This led to an urgent campaign against suspected launch sites in the Netherlands and Western Germany. Storage depots targeted, suspected assembly areas attacked. But this too had limits. The V-2 required no fixed launch pad. Mobile launch units could erect and fire a rocket within hours, then relocate before counterstrikes arrived. Camouflage, deception, and rapid movement made targeting difficult. Each destroyed site was replaced by another. For civilians, the fear became constant. Unlike bombing raids, which came in waves and could be anticipated, the V-2 created permanent anxiety. Any moment could be the moment. There was no all clear. Shelters offered little reassurance. The rockets struck with enough force to penetrate deep into buildings. Psychologists later noted that this unpredictability caused a unique form of stress. People did not panic outwardly. They internalized fear. Tension became ambient. Churchill himself acknowledged that morale, not casualties, was the weapon's true target. Ironically, this fear arrived at a moment when Germany could least exploit it. By late 1944, Allied armies were advancing on all fronts. The Battle of the Bulge would soon fail. German resources were collapsing. Fuel shortages crippled conventional forces. The V-2 consumed enormous resources and delivered little strategic return. Each rocket cost the equivalent of a bomber aircraft. Each launch consumed fuel Germany desperately needed elsewhere. Skilled engineers were diverted from more practical projects. Some German officers questioned the weapon's value openly. But the project continued. Why? Because the V-2 had become more than a weapon. It was a promise that technology could still reverse defeat, that innovation could compensate for lost territory and dwindling manpower, that fear could replace control. This belief was not entirely irrational. The V-2 forced the Allies to divert aircraft, intelligence assets, and manpower. It strained logistics, it caused real casualties, but it could not stop the advance, and its limitations grew more apparent with time. Accuracy was poor. Many rockets missed intended targets entirely. Some failed shortly after launch. Others broke apart mid-flight. Maintenance crews struggled to keep systems operational under constant pressure. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence gained ground. Captured documents revealed production bottlenecks. Interrogations uncovered launch procedures, surveillance identified patterns. The fog began to lift. By early 1945, V-2 launch rates declined sharply. Fuel shortages worsened. Launch crews lacked supplies. Facilities were overrun as Allied forces advanced. The terror remained, but the threat was fading. Still, the psychological impact lingered. Military analysts understood something profound had occurred. The V-2 represented a category shift in warfare. For the first time, a weapon had bypassed all defenses. Not temporarily, not conditionally, completely. It did not matter how skilled the pilots were. It did not matter how strong the defenses were. Once launched, it could not be stopped. That realization unsettled commanders deeply, because it suggested a future where defense would always lag behind offense. Where cities could be struck without warning. Where deterrence would depend not on interception, but on prevention or retaliation. Even as the war drew to a close, Allied scientists were already studying captured V-2's. Engineers examined guidance systems. Rocket engines were dismantled and shipped overseas. Knowledge was preserved, not to prevent repetition, but to replicate it. The fear the V-2 created was not something the victors wanted to eliminate. It was something they wanted to control, and that would shape the next era of warfare. By March 1945, V-2 attacks had largely ceased. Germany was collapsing. Launch units were captured or destroyed. The weapons moment had passed, but its legacy had just begun. The world had glimpsed a future where speed erased warning and technology outrun defense, and that future would not be ignored. When the war ended in Europe in May 1945, the V-2 rocket did not disappear. It was dismantled, disassembled, seized, catalogued, and shipped away piece by piece. The cities it had struck began to rebuild. The launch sites were abandoned. The crews who had fired the rockets were captured or scattered. But the weapon itself became the most valuable prize of the war. Within days of Germany's surrender, Allied forces were racing each other to secure what remained of the V-2 program. Entire units were diverted not to pursue retreating German troops, but to seize documents, engineers, and intact rockets before anyone else could. This was not about revenge. It was about the future. The United States, the Soviet Union, and Britain all understood the same thing. The V-2 had failed strategically in World War II, but it had succeeded technologically. It had crossed a threshold that could not be uncrossed. The question was no longer whether such weapons would exist. The question was who would control them next. In June 1945, American forces launched Operation Paperclip, a secret program designed to capture German scientists before the Soviets could reach them. At the center of that effort was Werner von Braun and his team, the same engineers who had built the V-2 under horrific conditions. They were not tried as war criminals. They were offered contracts. By September 1945, von Braun and dozens of key engineers were quietly transported to the United States. Along with them came V-2 rockets, blueprints, test data, and manufacturing knowledge. The Soviet Union was doing the same. Red Army units overran Peenemünde and Mittelwerk facilities, capturing rockets, tooling, and personnel. Soviet engineers interrogated German specialists extensively, then forced many to work on missile programs inside the USSR. Britain took what it could, but lacked the industrial scale to compete long-term. The result was a silent race, not unlike the arms race that would follow to absorb the lessons of the V-2 faster than anyone else. What made the V-2 so important was not its warhead. It was its principle. For the first time, a weapon had followed a purely ballistic trajectory, guided not by a pilot, not by radio commands, but by internal systems. It had demonstrated that cities could be struck across hundreds of kilometers without warning and without interception. This changed military thinking permanently. In 1946, the United States launched captured V-2 rockets from White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. These tests were not secret. Photographs were published. The public saw rockets rising vertically into the sky, symbols of progress, not terror. But military planners saw something else. They saw range. They saw payload capacity. They saw scalability. Within a few years, the V-2's descendants would grow larger, faster, and more accurate. Guidance systems improved. Fuels became more efficient. Warheads became more destructive. What had been terrifying in small numbers during World War II now became the foundation of something far more dangerous: intercontinental ballistic missiles. By the early 1950s, both the United States and the Soviet Union were openly testing long-range rockets. The logic was brutally simple: if one unstoppable weapon was frightening, thousands would be decisive. The fear that the V-2 had briefly introduced became permanent. This time, there would be no illusion of too late. The irony is that the V2's terror in World War II had been limited by scarcity. Germany could never build enough of them. Fuel shortages, bombing, and collapsing infrastructure ensured that the weapon remained an exception rather than a system. In the Cold War, that constraint vanished. Factories were protected, resources were abundant, time was available. The nightmare the V2 hinted at became doctrine. Cities were no longer defended, they were deterred. The goal was no longer interception, it was mutual destruction. The idea that civilians could be killed without warning became central to strategy. The V2 had not won a war. It had redefined how wars could end. Even space exploration traces its lineage directly to this weapon. The rockets that carried satellites, probes, and eventually humans into orbit were built on the same principles tested at Peenemünde. Von Braun himself would later lead NASA's Saturn V program, the rocket that carried astronauts to the moon. This uncomfortable continuity troubled many observers. The same equations that enabled spaceflight had enabled terror. The same engines that lifted humanity upward had once delivered destruction downward. The V2 forced the world to confront a disturbing truth. Technological brilliance is morally neutral. It amplifies intent, not ethics. That truth had been visible even during the war. The V2 program consumed tens of thousands of lives, not on the battlefield, but in underground factories where prisoners were worked to death. For every civilian killed by a V2 strike, several forced laborers had already died building it. This fact alone undermines any notion of the weapon as a triumph. It was not a miracle. It was a warning that innovation without restraint could outrun humanity's ability to control it. And yet, no one chose to step back, because fear had proven effective. During the war, the V2's greatest impact was psychological. It made people feel helpless. It removed agency. It demonstrated that survival could be random. Those same qualities made it attractive to future strategists. By the late 1940s, military planning increasingly revolved around worst-case scenarios. What if rockets carried nuclear warheads? What if warning times were minutes? What if no defense was possible? Those questions drove budgets, alliances, and doctrine. The world reorganized itself around a weapon that had arrived too late to matter, but too early to ignore. And in that sense, the V2 may have been the most influential failed weapon in history. It did not change the outcome of World War II, but it ensured that no future war would ever be the same. The terror it inspired in London and Antwerp was only the beginning. What followed was decades of tension, fear, and deterrence built on the same foundation. Speed without warning, power without interception, destruction without defense. That legacy remains with us, and it raises the final, uncomfortable question that this story leaves behind. If a weapon built too late could reshape the future so completely, what happens when the next one arrives right on time? The world that emerged after 1945 was quieter on the surface, but far more dangerous underneath. The cities stopped burning. The bombers returned to their bases. Soldiers went home, but the fear introduced by the V2 did not fade with the sound of the last explosion. It lingered, reshaped, and embedded itself into the very logic of global power. What the V2 had proven was not just that a city could be struck without warning. It proved that defense could become meaningless. This realization altered military thinking at the highest levels. In the years immediately following the war, generals and politicians no longer asked how to stop an attack. They asked how to survive one. And increasingly, the answer was bleak. You couldn't. That conclusion shaped everything that followed. By 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb. By 1952, the United States detonated the first hydrogen bomb. Soon after, both sides began actively pairing nuclear warheads with rocket technology derived directly from the V2. The result was the intercontinental ballistic missile, the nightmare that London had briefly experienced. Destruction without warning was now global. Early warning systems were built, but even they acknowledged the truth: detection did not equal prevention. At best, it offered minutes, sometimes seconds. The Cold War became a permanent standoff built on that premise. Unlike World War II, where weapons were designed to be used, these weapons were designed to exist. Their power lay not in their deployment, but in the fear of deployment. The V2 had introduced that logic, the idea that terror itself could be strategic. This was not an abstract fear. Governments drilled civilians for nuclear attack. Cities built shelters. Children were taught how to hide under desks. A symbolic gesture that revealed how little protection actually existed. All of it traced back to a moment when people realized that speed could erase choice. Ironically, the V2's creators never lived to see the full implications of what they had unleashed. Many of them transitioned smoothly into post-war scientific careers. Their work was reframed as progress, exploration, and innovation. The moral cost was rarely discussed. The thousands who died building the V2 were not part of the narrative of technological achievement. The civilians killed in London and Antwerp were footnotes. What mattered was capability. This selective memory made the weapon easier to celebrate and easier to repeat. As decades passed, the V2's story became sanitized. Museums displayed sleek rockets. Textbooks highlighted engineering breakthroughs. The fear it caused became a historical curiosity rather than a warning. But the logic it introduced never left. Modern warfare continues to chase speed. Hypersonic weapons, autonomous strike systems, and AI-guided missiles all pursue the same goals: to shorten reaction time until defense becomes irrelevant. The V2 was simply the first to reach that threshold. And like many firsts, it arrived before anyone truly understood the consequences. There is a temptation to view the V2 as a tragic anomaly, a weapon born of desperation, misused, and ultimately irrelevant. But that interpretation misses the deeper truth. The V2 was not a mistake of engineering, it was a mistake of timing. Built too late to change the war, but early enough to change the world. Had it been deployed in large numbers in 1942 or 1943, it might have altered strategic calculations. Allied resources would have been diverted earlier. Civilian morale might have been shaken more deeply. Political pressure could have increased. But those are hypotheticals. What matters is what actually happened. The weapon appeared when its creators no longer had the capacity to exploit it. Their industrial base was collapsing. Their territory was shrinking. Their enemies had already learned how to adapt. Technology could not reverse momentum. This is a lesson history repeats relentlessly. Innovation cannot substitute for time. Fear cannot substitute for control. And brilliance cannot undo strategic failure. The V2 stands as a monument to that truth. It terrified civilians because it removed warning. It terrified commanders because it removed defense. And it terrified the world because it suggested a future where neither mattered. Yet even in its terror, it revealed something else. Weapons do not determine outcomes alone. Context does. The same technology that failed to save Germany became the foundation of superpower dominance after the war. The difference was not design, it was timing, resources, and stability. That is why the phrase, "too late," matters more than "too powerful." History is full of weapons that were impressive. Few arrived at the exact moment needed to matter, and so it became something else, a warning sign, a glimpse of what happens when innovation outruns wisdom. As the final V2 rockets were fired in early 1945, no one celebrated. There were no parades, no strategic victories, just scattered destruction and the quiet understanding that the war was already lost. The weapon had done everything it was designed to do. It had terrified everyone and it had changed nothing. That is its legacy. Not victory, not defeat, but fear introduced too late and inherited by a future far more capable of using it. When historians look back on World War II, the V2 often appears as a footnote, but its shadow stretches far beyond the conflict that created it. Every time a missile launch is detected on radar, every time leaders speak of response times measured in minutes, every time deterrence replaces defense, the echo of that first silent explosion in London is still there, and the lesson remains as relevant now as it was then. The most dangerous weapons are not always the ones that win wars. They are the ones that arrive just late enough to teach the world how fragile safety really is.